Penny Lane, there is a barber showing photographs of every head he's had the pleasure to know, and all the people that come and go.
John Lennon is kind of the most political and say in a way most outgoing character in the Beatles. His songwriting deals with a lot of different issues. Sometimes he gets really angry. Sometimes they're really dark songs. They could be really sad as well. Paul McCartney and he shared a lot of the writing duties, but by the end of it, they were writing separate songs for the most part. Paul's songs are a lot happier, generally, and he doesn't really deal with too many different issues. George Harrison is kind of the most spiritual member of the band, and you can see this in his solo work. But in some of his songs with the Beatles, especially on Abbey Road, are some of his best tunes. And finally, Ringo, as the drummer, he actually is much better of a musician than people give him credit for. He's actually known as like being one of the most grooving drummers. He just plays really simple stuff, but just the way it feels is good, and he has a nice loose feel to his playing. So people don't really give him credit for that, but he's really a great drummer. And some of his fills are some of the most influential ones too.
So let's talk about the Beatles and collective effervescence, which is Durkheim's term for what happens when large groups of people get excited about the same thing at the same time. Does that sound correct? Yeah. I think one of the most interesting things that happened in the 1960s in England, but then also in America, is that large groups of teenagers were given the opportunity to come together and enjoy the excitement of being incredibly into something all together at once. Everybody's seen these images of like people screaming at concerts and crying and jumping up and down. And I think one of the most interesting things about what happened during this period is that in addition to just having a lot of fun, the collective effervescence that we associate with popular music, and in particular with youth music like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, is that it became a way for young people to have something that was especially their own, that belonged just to them, that distinguished them from the older generation, and that made them feel like they were part of something new that was theirs and kind of theirs alone. And so as soon as you get collective effervescence at concerts, you also begin to get things like fan magazines and fan clubs and people traveling together to go to concerts and festivals.
You write very good songs, don't you?
Thank you, thank you.
How do you write songs?
Well, we just depend. Sometimes we write them on old pianos and anything that's lying around, old trams.
Doesn't do the piano any good, yeah?
No, it's more to get into the recording studio. I've got a song, George. A great big piano. But guitars and things, normally we sit down and try and bash one out of it. But then again, there's no formula, because he can come up with one day completely finished. We still say we both wrote it though.
So Pink Floyd, one of the great bands from England, and I wanted to get into just a little bit about them. One of the things that got me interested in this band is just the melodic element. First of all, the guitarist, David Gilmour, is really bluesy, which has attracted a lot of people to them, I'd say. He's considered one of the great soloists. Roger Waters is this bass player and composer who wrote most of their songs, and he kind of thought big picture, so a lot of big album based compositions. So it's not just like individual songs, but long songs, and they like link together. to create like this kind of larger suites and things. So that's why their albums are so great, because you can listen to the whole thing. But there's lots of different things. They go through different rhythms, parts where there's no beat. They play in 6/8, they play in 4/4, they play slow and fast and that, before there's even any singing. And the other element, their drummer, Nick Mason, I think he was their second drummer, and he really added this jazz element to them, and created just a like loose atmosphere with a lot of improvisation. And finally, Richard Wright, their keyboardist, who's known. He also had a lot of jazz chops and technique. So you'll see like some of the chords and things they use aren't stuff you hear in most popular songs. So Pink Floyd, as far as their impact on the music industry, I don't know as far as sales go, but I would know like stylistically. I feel like a lot more bands came out with this kind of like highly like chord-based structures, like large structure pieces, and they really were one of the bands that made concept albums first. So I think that was their biggest contribution, is putting together big albums. It's kind of the opposite of right now, where you can buy individual songs. Back in the day, you had to buy the whole album, and so they were the best at putting together a complete album. So I think that even today it still exists, but I wouldn't say every band does that. It's a certain type of band that will do that and put together an album that is just a really long and connected album. I think that's their biggest influence. And stylistically, like their use of synthesizers and their guitar playing on David Gilmour were really influential, I think, too. Just his sound, people have been copying that for years. So I think those are their biggest influences.
Hey you, out there in the cold, getting lonely, getting old, can you feel me?
Right, well, I've only been once to a Pink Floyd concert, even though I've been a fan of theirs for, over 40 years. I became aware of the band right at the beginning when they first produced a record in 1966, right? I then saw them in concert while I was at university, and it was at a time when they were on the verge of making a real breakthrough into what you might call slightly more commercial music. That's a bit of a generalized label. But prior to that, the sort of music that they had been playing, on which I saw them perform, shall we say, was very experimental and very out there. Very much music as if it was music for outer space. And it was what you might call a sort of transcendental experience. There, you've used the word collective effervescence. I'm not sure that effervescence captures the mood of the audience. It was more a sort of not sleepwalking, but trance, a collective trance is how I describe being at this particular Pink Floyd concert. The way that the sounds that they created, which were very, very new in pop music at that time, sort of almost created an out-of-body experience for the people in the audience. And I remember going away thinking it was the most amazing thing I'd ever experienced in my life. And I regret that I've never actually seen them in concert since. And I regret that in particular, because in the years that followed, and with the success that they had, and with the resources they then had, their concerts became increasingly spectacular. as sound and light shows. So I regret not seeing that greater experience. The concert I went to was a more intimate experience with just a few hundred people there, as opposed to the tens of thousands they would eventually get at concerts. But I'm sort of privileged to feel that I experienced them in their early phase, when they were still very, very experimental in terms of the sort of sounds that they were creating with their instruments.
I feel like the Rolling Stones really benefited from the fact that the Beatles were there first and were even more famous and successful, because what the Rolling Stones were able to do was, although the Beatles were kind of weird and older people might have been uncomfortable around them, basically they were pretty innocent and kind of cuddly and nice, and what that allowed the Rolling Stones to do is be the bad boys to the Beatles' kind of nice boys group. So with the Rolling Stones, I think you have a group that tapped into some of the darker or more edgy energies of the 60s than the Beatles. And the Rolling Stones, I think, are particularly interesting and memorable for a lot of people for the kind of excitement that their early tours of America caused. And there's some really great stories about them traveling around the United States. They did some great recording in the United States, and although the Beatles did use early American rock and roll music for a lot of their early records, the Rolling Stones were much more involved in recording in America and in using American musicians and in using American recording studios to create a sound that was closer to something like American blues. And so their sound and their whole persona, their public image was of something that I think as kids got older and they outgrew the Beatles, the Stones was the perfect logical next step for them, because it was more rebellious and darker and more dangerous singing.
It's an accepted form of appreciation. Instead of clapping, they scream, and they scream everywhere. So it doesn't. It makes,
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
you know, it's just we think, well, they like us. That's all we feel.
Doesn't it disturb? Because it is rhythm and blues. It's a sort of jazz still. Doesn't it disturb the number?
No,
I don't think the number minds.
I think the most important thing to us is when we go on stage is that we succeed in communicating with an audience. And the only way we can do this is to produce an exciting atmosphere. Therefore, if the kids scream, we love it. You know, we react to their reaction.
Oh, I know.
If you create this,
Well, some nights are pretty right.
The louder they scream, you scream.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's right.